The West comes into countries and says, okay, you got your company law here and we are entitled to buy shares, we buy up your company. But when others want to do the same, China wants to do the same, and they say, no, this is security. I was the chief prosecutor, at the time for this War Crime Tribunal. So we filed a case against Bush and Blair at that time. His tribunal was an attempt to show the world that a war is wrong as an instrument of foreign policy.
Media Mundo.
Good afternoon. I'm here in Kuala Lumpur with Gurdial Singh Nijar, attorney, lawyer, law professor of the University of Malaya before. Gurdial Nijar was also involved in a very interesting court case, which was launched it was already in 2011, I think, right?
Yes.
The Kuala Lumpur Human Rights Commission. And I would like to talk with you about Malaysia in general as a country and its position in the world. Could we start maybe with how do we see Malaysia as being a country that was colonized before by the British, but also by the Dutch and Portuguese, and then getting independence. And
Yes.
Where are we now?
I think an interesting development in our Malaysian politics was that after 60 years of rule by a party that was given independence in 1957, there was a change of government in 2018, and it saw the return of Prime Minister Tun Dr. Mahathir, who had been in the previous government as a Prime Minister for a long time. Now, this Prime Minister Tun Mahathir is very nationalistic. He's very protective also of the Malay race and its position in the Malaysian politics and economics. And he's also very independent-minded and quite outspoken also. So he kind of, during the time when he was in the Prime Minister in the first Prime Ministership under the previous government, he set out on a foreign policy pathway that broke away from the hegemony of the West and the colonial masters, the British, before. And one of his most pronounced indication of that was when he said that we should not always look to the West, to Britain, the colonial power, for learning experiences and developing our economy. And he started what they call the Look East policy, which is to look to Japan and their ethics and their Asian context, cultural context, and so on. So he's been quite outspoken on those kind of issues. So when he came in 2018, he sort of developed that a little more carefully and more incrementally, and set himself on a pathway where he broke away from being subservient to the colonial past. And so that has made a remarkable change in the country's development since then. He does not accept, for example, hegemonic rule. One of the first things he did when he became a prime minister was to visit China and to develop some rapport with China on economic and political affairs. And so that has worked well, because after that, as you know, with the China-US tensions, we could have benefited, because a lot of American multinationals in China wanted a backup. And he was promoting that through various institutions in the country. But that didn't quite work out, because the bureaucratic setup in the country is such that it becomes, for example, when foreign corporations want land, they have to go to the state, because here it's a federal system where you have federal and state. And so if the states cannot give the land, then it becomes a bit of a problem for the multinationals to operate. So although they have an organization called Malaysian Industrial Development Authority, I was a board member of that, and they want to offer Malaysia as an alternative backup site for this foreign direct investment, they were not able to facilitate it, as a result of which, a lot of corporations went to Singapore, many went to Vietnam, and so on and so forth.
And that's quite recent, what you're describing now.
Yes.
But what about the years, so we're talking about the period of about 60, 70 years, 60 years that
Yes.
Malaysia is an independent country, and then you describe this as something new, but in the past, were there leaders that were also trying to break away?
Well, yes, like I explained there, that
Yeah.
Mahathir was also in the previous government. He's the one who started the Lukis policy. But by and large, the party of the day, the Barisan Nasional Party of the day, was always, reliant on the economic paradigm that the British had left behind, because the British had a lot of economic control. In fact, they had ownership and control of the Malaysian economy in a very big way. We had, trading houses which were controlled by the British, some by the French. We had, at that time, rubber was our mainstay product, and almost all the large estates were owned by British-related companies or directly British companies and so on, who then expatriated their profits to develop Britain and so on and so forth, as opposed to...
Yeah, the country was namely independent, but then there were still so many influences that they kept.
So we call it neo-colonial. So it's colonial, and then it is really, the whole country was geared towards the colonial empire. And that's why we call it neo-colonial. And then under Mahathir, also they started to wean away from that by buying up corporate interests and shares, in these companies to take over control. And finally, they didn't nationalize, but they did it through the normal capitalist system way, where you buy shares and follow the rules for buying shares and then take over control. So that's how they took over control of a large amount of estates that were owned by the British at that time, like Sime Darby and trading houses like Bousted and so on. And now a lot of those estates have been set up under what they call PNB, one of the largest landowners in the country that is government-linked. And then they also set up, after that, economic arm called Khazanah.
It's from the government.
They're from the government. Government-linked, they call it GLC, government-linked company, which means the government appoints the officers and government controls the policy and direction of those, although they're supposed to be independent and so on. But it is to further the economic and political advancement of the country, including foreign policy, economic affairs. So that slowly started weaning it away from the colonial empire, as it were. But by and large, the paradigm is still the same. You want to increase jobs, you call foreign direct investment. And you want foreign direct investment means you must offer good terms. And you must offer better terms than the neighboring countries, because everybody is following that same paradigm, Vietnam and Cambodia and Indonesia and so on.
And then, so now, first of course, we're coming from a very long time that the West was the most powerful, and
Yes.
we hear a lot of talking about that there is more empires coming up, and that the influence of China, Russia is making it more, so maybe a country as Malaysia has to play it very carefully.
Yeah, so Malaysia, for example, China is our biggest trading partner, parallel with the US. So there is a new fulcrum shift, pivot away from China, but of course it's complicated by this political pressures by the US, particularly, who want to, in our view, who want to contain China and get allies within ASEAN region to line up against China. And they've succeeded to some extent through the Philippines and through a little bit of Vietnam and so on and so forth. But they still want to make inroads. And Singapore, for example, is their biggest ally. Singapore is like their, unkind word, but it's like really their stooge in the region. The Trojan horse, as it were, very strongly in favor of allowing America, because on the basis that America can provide the security. When America was fighting the Vietnam War, Singapore was one of the main bases for R&R, recreation and rest for American soldiers, and so on and so forth.
And that's very, part of this, I mean, very close to Malaysia.
Yeah, so
previously part of Malaysia.
Yeah, so the problem then is now ASEAN is there. ASEAN consists of a large number of countries, 12 to 15 countries, but within it you have countries that have differing interests. Like I mentioned, for example, Singapore is one, always stands out as one that kinds of, provides a kind of, if you like, a check and balance against ASEAN moving to a more independent, non-aligned position. They are always there to moderate it. They call it moderated, but we call it blocking the ASEAN consensus on many areas, including environment, political, geopolitics, statements in relation to Myanmar or the South China Sea and so on and so forth.
So can you also think that, let's say, the colonial empire, the West, as we call it, still exists, still using its power, but
yes.
do you see a change?
There is an attempt to change, but it becomes very difficult because we are captive to the economic paradigm. For example, you see, like now we see the latest move is, US is trying to prevent China from the AI and so on, and one of the critical elements is chips. So as you know, the biggest chip factories were the biggest producer of chips was Taiwan, and they have, through their influence and their relations with Taiwan, got the whole factory moved to production process moved to America, for example. And now a lot of the chip producers, or those who use chips and need the chips, have downstream have invested very heavily. For example, Intel and all these people, and they have now. So Malaysia is one of those countries vying for that, and they have indicated some interest in investing in the downstream chip trade here, chip production process here. So we are still in that right up to now, and we are vying for it, and we are trying to oust others, not oust others, but trying to give better terms. So better terms in a developing country like ours, and competing with other developing countries means a downward spiraling of our national interests, because if someone says you come tax-free for 2 years, we say no, we give you 4 years, and so you are deprived of that income for 4 years as opposed to 2 years. So this kind of competition, which is relied upon by all these multinationals who have wielded a lot of power, is inimical to the interests of the development of the country itself. And somehow the country, including the present government, which is supposed to be based on reformacy, that is trapped in that paradigm. So unless they move away from that paradigm, they have to, if they don't have jobs, then people have no consumption, and there's no money in the market, and and then you have to then go back to begging for what they call foreign direct investment, and for that you have to beg, which means you have to give concessions and so on. So we are, until we move away from that particular paradigm. They have tried to move away because they've got also big corporations and obviously
but it's
government
very
support.
Risky also, right? If you do it too bluntly, maybe there will be a response, or
yes, there will be a reprisal against them. But if you don't move away, you are caught in this trap again, because like now, for example, our exports are very expensive. A lot of our food, for example, even onions and garlic and ginger, we access from India. Our vegetables we import from Taiwan and so on. So our currency is weak, and so food costs go up. People they're not starving or anything like that, but they have a problem with providing for a condition of living that is sustainable, especially in rural areas. So we have a problem with that, and we don't know how to control it. Basically, we can have price controls, but you have price controls, people move away from your country.
So
they want to have confidence. The perception is very important. So our stock market is a big wealth creator, and so once the fund managers from the West withdraw their funds, the stock market crashes or goes down. Then people start selling shares, and people start being control their pockets, their money in their pockets. There's no consumption, there's no generation of income, you see.
And I've been to Indonesia a lot, and if I compare, so this is my first time in Malaysia, but it seems that Malaysia's economy was stronger compared to, for example, Indonesia, but also a lot of political things happened in the past.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, what is your view on the, I just discovered that actually Malaysia is still part officially from the Commonwealth, right?
Yeah.
Does that have any significant meaning or
Well, someone once said cynically, the Commonwealth name is a misnomer because there is no wealth that is spread commonly around,
Yeah.
Right? It's just a device for colonial perpetuation in terms of perception, in terms of dignity and so on, but very little else. The real thing is in the economy, that is, the ownership and control of the economy is the problem, you see, and the way our economic development is being geared. For example, you see, you find in large parts of the country, I do a lot of public interest cases and act for farmers, and there are farmers in Penang, in Perak, these are states in the north, where farmers have been producing fruits, vegetables, poultry, eggs, and for the market for years and years. Then the government just comes along, some developer comes along and, through various means, I don't want to say what exactly the means are, but he wants that land that has been cultivated to put condos and so on and so forth. And then they get, the farmers are displaced, and the farmers are providing food security, you see, for the local economy. But the government doesn't step in to do anything about it, So the whole economy, once it's skewed in that direction, then so many other problems follow in the wake of that. And unless you, in our view, unless you change the paradigm of development, you are bound to be trapped in this kind of a situation where you then have to give in to the powerful and the wealthy,
And Malaysia is not alone in this. I mean, it's global.
Yes, and
compared to, for example, the countries in Indonesia, I find that here, and it's maybe somehow a little bit contradicting. Like on one hand, I see a lot of British or colonial influence still there, like also the language. But at the other hand, I see that there are leaders who are quite, let's say, anti-colonial in their speech. That I would never expect an Indonesian politician to be so openly anti-US.
Yes, but I think, like I said, it developed. It once when Mahathir came in the first time, he was the one who broke that pathway of being subservient to Western hegemony. So he was the one who kind of showed that the political party in power can take a stance which is different, because he attributes a lot of the like I told you, he's nationalistic, and he's also very pro-Malay. He attributed a lot of the underdevelopment of the country and the poorer sectors, which happen to be the Malays, to colonial rule. So he was very strident in that kind of approach. And the separation of races, and then giving advantage to some particular ethnic group as opposed to the other group. He wrote the book The Malay Dilemma, in which he highlights that whole economy was skewed in a way which trapped the. And
do you agree with that?
Yeah, he's largely was correct, and he used that as a basis because the Barisan National Party that was Malay based. So when he started talking about the fact that the Malays were put down because of this, their education, the places in universities, and so on and so forth, and the whole thing erupted in May 1969 when there was a race riots, and he used that. He was Prime Minister at that time. He used that opportunity to, he was not the Prime Minister at that time, Tun Razak, and then he used that opportunity to say that we must have a proactive policy to provide more opportunities for Malays, and the state must come into the picture.
And that's how he created that affirmative action.
Yes, so he started
policy.
what they call the new economic policy,
Yeah.
which was to basically is to provide equal opportunity. It is not to not the way it is being done now. But so for example, in universities, he said, okay, 40% must be Malay.
Yeah, because
students.
it was not like that before.
That's
There
right.
was an inequality, and he tried to make it
That's
equal.
right.
Yeah.
So he felt that this was the only way, because he wrote in the Malay Dilemma the fact that for example, the economy was aside from the colonial, the domestic economy was controlled to a large extent by the Chinese entrepreneurs, who were very entrepreneurial for good reason to develop and so on. And he found that in those kind of setups, there was no opportunity for advancement of the Malay race, because they will maybe employ you as a driver or as a human relations manager or something, but nothing that is more than that so he started this proactive policy in which the state then helped Malay entrepreneurs to become own corporations like MAS and so on, the Malaysian Airline, and a few other big organizations.
And he never got like a response like from the West, like a negative, maybe, for example, I'm thinking about before you had Sukarno, but who was then replaced by a pro-Western puppet like Suharto.
Yeah.
Something like this did not happen here.
Well,
he was allowed.
No, he was. I think he was quite skillful. He was very incremental and very social justice kind of a rationale. So when you want to introduce more Malays into universities, who can object? Because you are saying that there is an imbalance. If you want to introduce more opportunity for shares in the market to be also equally apportioned.
Yeah, but that's domestic. But when it comes to his foreign policy, and he's so vocal, and maybe we can also discuss now the Tribunal, the initiative. This was also his initiative?
Yes, his initiative, entirely his initiative.
Because it's quite confrontational, I think, to if we say that this tribunal convicted like people like George Bush and Tony Blair. I mean, I never read that, but that's quite seems like radical.
Yeah, very radical.
But there was no I'm just curious.
So
how is it possible that this was sort of being allowed by this world power that is usually very revengeful and
Yeah, but I think there was he was quite skillful in the sense that he kind of balanced this out. You see, he did not nationalize anything.
So it was diplomatic in a way.
Yes. You see, in this country, there are a lot of state-owned enterprises. They are the big boys. The PNB, I told you, which owns almost all the estates in the country, and a lot of land is state-owned. Khazanah is state-owned. So he then operated through the state-owned because he said the state must take control and then distribute what they call distributive justice in terms of politics, economics, and so on and so forth.
But you also said before that he also reduced the British influence, which they started. But that's they don't. I'm sure they don't like that.
No, they don't like that. But he played by the rules. You see, for example, he went and did what they call the tin raid. The tin industry and so on and so forth. And he played the game.
Yeah.
In the corporate way. Quite smart through his expert advisors and so on. And so they couldn't block it because at that time, you can go into the market and buy things. I want to buy shares in British Airways, I can do that, because there are the systems out there. So use that system. But later, then the Americans woke up to this, and the West woke up to this, and then they started what they call free trade agreements and regional free trade agreements, the CTPP and so on and so forth, in which they wanted to control everything. So previously,
the opposite of free trade, actually, but
yes,
they call it free trade.
Yes, because previously, because they ruled so well, the West, and they had a neo-colonial power, and they had what do you call, not nice word to say, but people in government who would, in the national government, who would promote that, through a variety of reasons. They could maintain control. But when there started this independent kind of attitude that was displayed, even in Malaysia by Mahathir's regime at that time, then they started these free trade agreements to control and restrict them. So for example, previously the whole idea was you cannot nationalize. So for example, we had estates here and corporate interests here belonging to British, American, and so on. So you cannot nationalize. You nationalize is against international law and so on and so forth. But for them that was not enough, because they were some of the governments, you know, with people who were trained in the West and all, came back and said, look, this is not the way, because you still are losing control of our economy and monies and so on and so forth, being expropriated. Through this trade agreement, then they started extending the meaning of what is nationalization. So for example, they say, if a company comes in here and you have given them a license to operate for 5 years or 10 years or whatever, like Linus, for example, in, I don't know whether you know this, Lynes, Linus in Pahang, to produce rare earths and so on. You give them a license, and if halfway through you decide not to allow them to continue, then that is also expropriation. But then they introduced a procedure called ISDS, Interstate Disciplinary Scheme or something, which means that company, which is a private company having a private deal, can sue the government for loss of profits for the entire period that they would have been there.
Yeah.
So as a result of that, this is called ISDS. As a result of that, they have gone and taken action. There is a group of lawyers who go around, you know, and do this on a contingency basis, you know. So okay, whatever money I get, you give me 30-40% or something. In Ecuador and Russia and so on and so forth. And they've got awards in the international arbitration centers of billions of dollars. So that compromises the sovereignty of the country. So we have been quite strident in opposing this, you know, some of us, because it compromises the sovereignty of the country. So for example, like Linus is producing rare earths is radioactive. So if we can show through the course of some period of Linus operating that it is indeed radioactive and affecting the health of the people, and the government wants to come in and say, for that ground we therefore either are going to impose stricter conditions for your operation, or we have to disengage you from our country, they can sue you under ISDS.
So they use this as an instrument to still do,
That's right. So you see, so the point that I'm making is this, that we were playing by the rules, but the rules were not adequate, so they changed the rules.
Yeah, I understand.
So they changed the rules and undermined. So once you join this and you're subject to ISDS, then your sovereign right to advance your national interests for economic or environmental, ecological, and various other grounds, social justice grounds, is compromised. You cannot do that. If, for example, you allow them to have 100 foreign workers, and then now you realize that you wanted to increase opportunities for local workers, so you said from 100 you reduce to 30 or something, or 40. You can't do that, because you have changed the ground rules on which you allowed that company or whatever to operate.
So in this, actually it's a little bit same with the case about that the Malaysia allows via the WTO, the World Trade Organization, against the EU. They say, the European Union says that they care so much about deforestation, about the environment, about human rights. But then on the other hand, Malaysia is complaining that they're, by doing this, restricting the actual...
You see, this is the problem, because they still have that neo-colonial kind of paradigm, the capitalist system of a rather extreme nature in developing countries because of their previous control. So they keep changing the rules. The WTO, for example, came in at a time when, again, they wanted to control the development of the country. For example, you see, GATT, they had general agreement on tariff trades, GATT at that time, from 1948. Then they found this is not effective enough for them to control, because the countries were becoming very independent and so on. So then they started this WTO. And everything, they said, okay, we agree GATT is related to trade, so we can impose restrictions based on trade. So everything they put trade-related intellectual property rights. So you cannot have intellectual property rights. You cannot breach intellectual property rights of the West. Why? Because you restrict their trade. and so it's trade related, so you're subject to WTO and to the disciplinary process of the WTO. And then they introduce new topics. For example, they introduce ownership of seats. Now, in developing countries, India, China, Malaysia and all, we have a large rural population. India has millions of rural population, smallholders relying on farming activities and so on. And one of their whole basis of productivity and fertility and so on and so forth, and their livelihood is through farming. And every year they have festivals, they have harvest festivals, they call it. After the harvest, they exchange the farmers amongst themselves, community based, they exchange seeds. And that seed is that seed that has been the best production in that particular farm, because it has been resilient maybe to weather changes and to rainfall and so on and so forth. They exchange it, and this is the basis of cooperation on which farmers have thrived for years. Now these big seed companies come in like Cargill and all this, and they feel, oh, we can make some money out of this. So they go to farmers, they take that seed and they patent it.
Yeah, that's already going on for decades.
Yes, so they can't patent it, because patent is for industrial products. So they introduce new rules, and then they impose it on all countries. They go down and impose it on all countries. And so they change the whole ethos and basis upon which communities operate.
Yeah.
Again, in the name of trade. So this is called trade-related intellectual property rights, and they introduce this under a provision in the WTO, and say you can't do it.
Yeah, so according to you, this whole WTO is still a very colonial organization.
Yes, it is.
It's not international agreed. I mean, you can see it clearly that it's being used.
Yeah, and the WTO was negotiated under very strange terms, because the way in which it was negotiated, it was mainly the pharmaceutical lobby and the big industrialists who were entertained, and some when they have what they call the blue room or something like that, will go in with the director general, and maybe they bring one Bangladesh representative and all these big boys with their lawyers and so on and so forth. And they do that, you see, they control through that and institute this. Now I've been involved in a lot of international negotiations under the Biodiversity Convention, the Biosafety Protocol, climate change and so on, And you see, it's a very unbalanced playing field, because the Americans, they are organized under JUSCANs, Japan, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. They come in. And America, for example, is not a member, but it has the greatest influence there, through these people. So when we object saying, why is America speaking, then the others will speak for them. And they will dilute the effect of, for example, the Biodiversity Convention, all the good provisions that we want. They'll argue and negotiate until late into the night, and negotiate until it is reduced to nothing, and then they won't join. Yeah. And then they use extra methods outside of the convention to put influence, because they said, if you do this, I'm going to impose sanctions on you. Yeah. Right? And they use extra methods under their act. I don't know what, Act 335 or something like that they have.
So you resisted against this policy of trying to
yes, I was involved,
and you feel that it was, although you were resisting, it was not working out because of their political power.
Yes, because of political power. And you see, for example, climate change. I was involved with climate change, I was spokesperson for the like-minded group, which includes of China, India, Arab Emirates, Cuba, and all that, Indonesia, Malaysia, and all that kind of countries. But end of the day, we can try to damage control, at best. So they want a certain provision, and you have to bring it in and argue and so on and so forth and everything, and try to moderate it. But basically they wield the greatest power, because they have the economic power, they have the economic thrust, they have the ability to corrupt governments, they have the ability to sanction countries, they have the ability to have regime change. And through war also, as we know, like Iraq and so on, they can do anything they want. So the whole world is actually held to some sort of a ransom by this.
Yeah, still.
So for example, like if you take the example of the International Criminal Court, You see, International Criminal Court was needed. Everybody agreed it was needed, and so on and so forth, because of international war crimes. And America participated, one of the most active participants. And all the other countries, just to get America on board, because otherwise the International Criminal Convention will make no sense, International Criminal Court, because they are the biggest violators, so no point having small countries only involved. But what happens is that they then reduce everything to the barest minimum, dilute it to the weakest provisions, and then when it comes to signing, because we have made all the concessions to them, then they don't become members.
Yeah.
And they operate outside of it.
But still use it as a...
And then they say that if you bring their people to International Criminal Court, they will impose sanctions against you.
Yeah.
And get all countries to impose sanctions. So for example, the Afghanistan situation. See, Afghanistan is a member. So if any country which is not a member commits something within the country which is a member, they can refer the matter to ICC. But they've already warned, you see, that if you refer the matter to ICC, then we cut off aid, we cut off this, we cut off that, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So the world largely, unless it is revamped in a particular way, and we have seen what's happened, for example, with the mortgage crisis in America, where, as they say, when America catches a cold or sneezes, we all get affected, right?
Yeah.
And how the whole currency situation, people's economies go into turbulence.
Yeah.
And we saw the 1987 currency crisis,
Yeah.
where after that, they created the crisis, through all this, money manipulations. And later on, they came up and made the government responsible. So if a private enterprise enters into an agreement with an American enterprise and fails, they made, under the IMF and so on, they made the government responsible for that debt, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
If you lie into a transaction worth billions, and then something happens, and it doesn't work out and you can't pay me, then they make the government pay. And then they picked up a lot of banks and big type corporations in South Korea, in Indonesia and so on, for what they call fire sale prices, which means you have to sell because otherwise the whole thing is blowing up anyway.
Yeah.
So the point that I'm making is that despite all these attempts, every time there is an attempt to move in a particular direction, to create independence from this kind of a clutch that colonial kind of rule has imposed upon the country, and captured it within that framework, there's always a change of rules which are outside of our control.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing you correctly, you see it very clearly that there is still a lot of influence and that you're still playing the game very unfairly, actually, against what we call justice. It's the opposite of justice what they do, and they use a lot of hypocritical means to do that. But at the same time, I see that you also resisted it. So it means if you resist, it means that you also still believe you have to do something, and that it may have, or maybe you hope that it still has effect.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the motivation behind this Kuala Lumpur
War Crimes Tribunal, International War Crimes. Yeah, you see, this was a confluence of interests led mainly by the Prime Minister, because he saw how, for example, in Iraq and all these Muslim countries, right, there was the use of force on false basis to create havoc and destroy countries, like Iraq and so on, which was a very developed, highly civilized cultural country for a long, long time. But because they resisted, Gaddafi resisted, and all these people who refused to accept the hegemony of the West, they were removed. So those days is very simple, like Grenada, they just send some people in and capture the president and bring him to Florida and charge him and so on. But as people became more and more conscious of their sovereignty and rights of sovereignty and so on, they had to change their ways. So they changed in very skillful ways, through other means and all that. And we saw how Iraq was on the basis of lies upon lies, and they were prepared to go to the United Nations to propagate to the whole world lies about weapons of mass destruction, knowing full well, now it's very well documented, that they knew all the while that that was a lie. And they of course went to the Security Council to get the resolution, but when countries like France and so on refused to accept that, then they just said we can do it in our own right. So for example, in the UK, the Attorney General at that time advised against the Iraq War and said the UK must not participate in the Iraq War. But then after that they called the Attorney General to America and got him to change his view. And that's very well documented now.
Yeah.
So the point I'm making is this, that we are still trapped in this framework of hegemonic colonial rule, hegemonic neo-colonial rule. And this is the real impetus for this fight against China and to some extent other countries. Because China provides an alternative framework. Easy, in those days it was easy because they say it's communist, no freedom, you can't dress what you want, you can't do this, you can't, and you'll be sent to rehab centers and killed like happened in Cambodia and all that. But as the world became more information worthy in terms of knowing about what is going on, China presents a real alternative threat to them. And that is why they have to do things that are outside now even of the rules that they have made.
Yeah, it becomes even more obvious. Actually.
Yes, more obvious, like sanctions, for example. You don't agree with them, they impose sanctions. And okay, you want to impose sanctions, I impose sanctions against you because I will fight with you, that's fine. But then I say that if he supports you and all other countries support you, then they also get sanctioned. And because of their economic control and their trading, where they take in the trade of most countries, they're in a position to influence that. And where they can't influence it through trade and through corruption, they impose it through war.
Yeah.
As happened in
but
all these
then
other.
still my question is, I understand you see it as a real, that the power is still very real and still very dominant, but then still you try to do something with this tribunal. How do we see this? How to interpret this move?
You see, this tribunal was an attempt to show the world that a war is wrong as an instrument of foreign policy. Right, that was the first point. And that this is after the Second World War, we set up the United Nations Security Council to prevent that from happening.
Yeah.
Only the UN can sanction war and so on, as an instrument for settling disputes. So people like Mahathir and the government picked up on this anti-war kind of situation, right, and started a campaign of that is crime to commit war. It's not war crimes. War crimes means you take to war and you can commit crimes, but within a certain framework. It is criminalizing
war in itself. Yeah.
Yes, war itself. One of the prime examples of that, criminalizing war and destroying a country, was of course the Iraq war.
Yeah.
Because the evidence was very clear. Even the Secretary General of the United Nations at that time came up and said that they have no authority to carry out that war. This war is illegal.
Yeah.
So that provided the impetus for people who were anti-war and anti-hegemonic power, like Mahathir and a large number of countries, to galvanize international public support on this issue. So of course they then started this International War Crimes Tribunal, which is really international because it got international panel of judges.
From which countries were people?
We were from America, from UK, from Europe, from Africa, and everywhere. I was the chief prosecutor, at the time for this War Crimes Tribunal. So we filed a case against Bush and Blair at that time, and we produced a lot of documents, and we also produced a lot of witnesses, people who had been taken from Afghanistan, Bagram, and all these places, transported to Guantanamo, and then later they tried to bring them to the US Supreme Court and so on, to show how all this was going. The proceedings are produced in a book, which I can let you have a look at. We gave notice to the American Embassy and UK Embassy, but they didn't participate. I think they sent people, but they didn't participate actively.
Yeah.
And they came to a conclusion, and the verdict was sent to the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court acknowledged the letter and all, but refused to do.
Okay, they only recognized what? The letter? But
yeah, they just acknowledge it, not recognize it. Acknowledge, when I send you a letter, you say, oh, thank you, I received your letter, and refuse to have, you see?
Yeah, of course.
And then after that, we also had another action against Israel and Yaron because of the massacre in Sabra and Shatila, in Lebanon, which the UN also had set up an inquiry and found that this was a very brutal massacre. And we also had witnesses who came, who had witnessed this. And they came and gave evidence.
They testified here?
Yes, testified
in front of the
tribunal, yes.
Okay.
Same with Bush and Blair, also all those Guantanamo detainees all came, It was a very important one. It was not covered internationally, but it was all these people giving evidence of what happened to
them.
them.
It was not big
because
international media.
I know, because it's blocked, as you know, mainstream media won't publish
censored
it.
Sort of,
So this also was very important, Sabra Shatila, because it was, they just line up the male members of the family and then line them up and shoot them, in front of the wives, mothers, children, everything. And then mothers who got pregnant, they cut open their stomach and take out the baby and kill it and so on. And this was witnessed by what's her name? Dr. I don't know whether you've heard of it. She's written a book on it because she was in a hospital across and she saw all this.
She saw it happening. Yeah. So she was one of the
witnesses, very important witness. So there also the tribunal found Israel government as well as the Yaron, who was at that time the defense minister, guilty of that. And in that we also explored the whole history of the Israel occupation or entry into that area right from 1948, and we had a lot of Israeli scholars, Ilan Pape and all these people who gave evidence in this case. Very important again because they are scholars now in England. They've moved away, but who have recorded these historical events right from the beginning of time. Of course, that also was sent to the International Criminal Court, and they didn't bother about it and all that.
Yeah.
So
so the conviction was also at that time already the word genocide. That was
yes.
And then how do you see now? Because we are years later, more than 10 years later, now we have these court cases, among others by South Africa, but then it is done within the framework of the court in The Hague.
Yes.
What is your view on that? Do they have any chance, or what do you think?
No, I think it's quite clear that as far as the ICJ is concerned, that the fact that it's genocide is very clear because in my view, of course, the point now this is an interim order. That is, interim order means I see a threat and I say the threat is real or it could be real, so I want something to be stopped. For example, if next door somebody starts excavating the land because they want to build something, and my geologists say, if you start putting that, if they go any deeper, this could tilt, you see.
Yeah.
Then, of course, the other side will say, no, we got our geologists saying it's all solid, nothing will happen, we'll put in piles and so on. But we argue and say, okay, fine, maybe you're right, but maybe I'm right. So, in the interim, in the meantime, to prevent this as a precautionary measure, you stop your work.
Yeah.
So that's interim.
Yeah.
So now again, that as far as genocide in ICJ case is concerned, is an interim measure because they say arguably South Africa and others could be right in saying it's genocide. So you have to stop that in the interim. Pending the real case going to be held later and so on and so forth, maybe in a few years' time. But what do you call it? Israel has indicated very clearly that as far as they are concerned, this is rubbish. There's no basis.
Yeah, of course.
And and there's no genocide. In fact, South Africa was guilty of genocide and so on and so forth. So basically, it's a very defined approach to say that you can decide what you want, we will participate in it to show why you are talking nonsense. But that is the limit of our participation. Our participation, because sometimes when a case is being heard and you participate, they'll say, oh, you're bound by it because you participated and you lost. So you cannot say like a football game, just because you lost, say no, I don't recognize this game because it was played under hot conditions and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So they participate, but they participate to show that this is illegal, this is nonsensical, there's no basis, they have no jurisdiction to decide this case, and they will not agree with it. And there's an example of this in the ICJ case of the wall. Because when they constructed the wall, the wall separating the settlers' colonies and so on and so forth in West Bank, they brought this case to the ICJ. Israel participated actively. The ruling was the wall is illegal, it has to be torn down, it has to come down. You cannot allow this. You are an occupier country cannot have that kind of jurisdiction, to against another state and so on. And until today, they said, as far as they are concerned, that's a nonsensical decision.
Yeah.
We will
but
ignore
that's,
it.
I think, so on one hand we have this institution in The Hague, which is like until today it's the mainstream known and recognized Institute of International Law, but at the other hand you here in Malaysia created something outside of that framework, but both have limitations because on one hand when you did that, nobody, the media are quiet and you're not being recognized, but the other hand is also limited because of what you just described.
But ours, you see, ours was had a different purpose and objective. Ours was because there was a failure by the international institutions. Then we started this process, a process of awareness first. And actually the awareness also and the whole process was to feed into the international institution process, because they say there's no evidence, like now, Gaza, right? They don't allow journalists except on a restricted basis to go into Gaza to record things and so on. So when one side says this is happening, they say no, this is Hamas ministries figures, and they bluff and so on. When Russia talks about their recent bombing and say they are from Ukraine, they say, oh rubbish, this is just an attempt to politicize the issue and so on and so forth. So this KL War Crimes Tribunal was about collecting that information in a very coherent, formalistic way. There were rules. We followed the rules of the International Criminal Court in collecting evidence.
But it was also a critique on against the same court, basically, because you were almost saying like you are not doing what you should do, and how it should be done.
It was not a critique, but it was what we call filling in the gap. It is a gap measure because nobody was doing anything about it. So some leaders in the world decided, look, we've got to do something. And then they did the something, you see. It's just like what South Africa has done now, because nobody is doing anything. So they bring the case in ICJ, although they are a different country, different place, people are not affected directly and so on. So that was the whole idea of the International Kuala Lumpur International War Crimes Tribunal. But of course it came to nothing because, of the hegemonic power of
still being so.
So on
but
so forth.
it's also because if there's so much evidence and documentation that you collected in these court cases, it's also actually important proof of that people, the pro-Israeli people use the argument that because of 7 October, but actually you show your evidence shows then that
yes, that's right.
It underlines
that's right.
It's long history that was already.
We have, and then they also have the Russell War Crimes Tribunal in Netherlands or Brussels or somewhere, right? The Russell's War Crimes Tribunal. They also have international stuff. So all these are attempts by NGOs and the qualitative change is that governments have taken this on. You see, last time NGOs will take it on, who are interested in these issues or want to advance these issues. But then with the KL War Crimes Tribunal, now with the South African government, and now with this and that, and BRICS as the alternative fulcrum, and China and so on, now their scope is being restricted even further. So they have to think of new devices. They will try to wriggle out of this through developing new rules and new this and so on. So the struggle is long, hard, steep curve, and is going on, but at a pace which is being controlled, and still the hegemonic powers, and that is where the role of China comes in. You see, that is why they have to curtail China. So when they established the WTO, they said there must be an open free trade system. So open free trade system means, for example, your state-owned enterprises. You see, you have a lot of developing countries, the state owns the enterprises because they have to develop it, because the people don't have the economic weight to develop those things. Then they introduce these trade agreements to say, state-owned enterprises also you must open it up to us and so on.
Yeah.
So they keep developing these rules to curtail your power, and the state tries to fight against it in some way. If you look at the China's example, you see they come into countries, the West comes into countries and says, okay, you got your company law here, and we are entitled to buy shares, we buy up your company, whichever company it is, because they have the money and so on. But when others want to do the same, China wants to do the same in other countries because they now have the economic weight, to do things and buy shares. They say, no, this is security. This is, raises issues of national interests and data leakages and so on, like they're doing to TikTok now, they did to, Huawei and so on. So they keep changing the ground rules, you see?
Yeah, all the time.
All the time.
Yeah. Are you, how optimistic are you? Because, it sounds quite almost depressing if you really believe that this is sort of never-ending story. Is there hope?
Yeah, well, I mean, on the one hand, it is depressing when you look at it in terms of, how the outcomes are always very disappointing. Yeah, so my point is there is hope, because if you look at the development of the world politics and the economics and the wherewithal of developing countries, you find that they are more strident now. So there is an attempt to provide an alternative kind of voice, strong voice, and that was demonstrated very clearly in the recent Security Council resolution on Gaza, where the US resolution was rejected in favor of the resolution of the permanent members. And that suggests an optimism, because the direction, the trajectory is going. So it will keep rising, and as mentioned, there could arrive a critical stage at which there's a qualitative change. Like, water, you keep boiling water, after a while, it stops its boiling, becomes steam. But the base must be correct for that to happen. So it is like an example that you can give of an egg and a chicken, right? You put a hen sits over a stone, looking like an egg, nothing happens. But if the groundwork is correct, which is, if it is a real egg, then you will hatch into a chicken and so on. So that is the kind of optimism that many of us sort of look towards.
And can we see then your resistance that you give, that it's also meaningful to get this water boiling? Because if you don't give resistance, then it will never get to the boiling point.
So that is where all these acts come into the picture of the resolutions, the KL War Crimes Tribunal, the awareness, and this is of course now helped greatly by social media. And that is why there is also a changing of ground rules in relation to the social media, like we saw in Huawei, the 5G, the TikTok and so on, to restrict that as well.
They try.
So they are supposed to be the West is supposed to be the champion of human rights, and anything in China that is suspect, they raise it on a continuous, incessant basis to condemn it. And at the same time, you have this hypocritical attitude towards Gaza, for example, the different attitude in Ukraine and Gaza. But the interesting thing is that large numbers of the world, especially developing countries, are beginning to realize the hypocrisy.
But is it not that, maybe more times in history, but let's say in the 1950s, we had this non-alignment movement that was, among others, in the Bandung conference in Java, in Indonesia. Was that not also such a point in history that the non-aligned countries were realizing what was going on? But as we saw the history after that, there was a... You see, the problem is, as I say, we are still trapped in that same framework on international politics and international relations. I mean, I participate in this international
negotiations, which are very critical because they determine, like food security is determined in these conferences, what you do, what you don't do. But still, the power of the north of the Western countries is too strong, given the fact that our paradigm for change and for development is still within a framework of relying on the West for our investments and for our employment and for our foreign exchange and so on and so forth. We are trapped. And then we have the international Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank and so on, which is controlled.
Still,
So if a country gets into problem, a country in Africa gets into problem and has exchange problems, so like Greece, for example, even in Europe, the IMF comes up with a remedy. Right? And what is the remedy? The remedy is you must cut down on wasteful expenditure. What is wasteful expenditure? Expenditure for rural schools, for farms, for smallholders, because that's a waste. That the income for that is
so again,
very
the
minimal.
lowest, the poorest, the weakest will.
Whereas in a developing country, you see, in developing countries, everything is to improve social justice. It's not only about returns. So you might have to build a bridge that is between one village to another village. You might have to build a bridge to facilitate production process and the sale of goods and so on. But it yields no money because the bridge, you're going to spend 5 million to build the bridge, but you're not going to get back your 5 million in 20 years. But in a developing country, we need to balance this kind of social justice. When you have institutions like IMF and World Bank, they don't look at that. To them, the bridge is a waste. Why are you spending 5 million?
They only look at the profit from a profit side.
How are you going to pay? That's how are you going to pay for it? You cannot pay for it. You close the bridge, or you don't build the bridge, or you close the schools. You close this.
Although they use again, maybe hypocritical, but they use these languages like development and the social justice and all these beautiful words. They do use that. I think.
But you see, we have an answer to that, which is that we have development is not antithetical to other processes. So somebody wants to develop something, wants to pull up a condominium. What should a developing country bureaucracy put into the equation in making a decision in relation to that, balancing all the competing interests? One is, of course, for example, when they cut forest, the Japanese came here and cut all the forests. And they cut the forest and then they take this wood to make chopsticks in Japan and spread it throughout the world and so on and so forth. So, one of the planning considerations is, it'll increase jobs because when they cut, they have to engage local labor, and then we get foreign exchange currency because, we charge a certain amount for them taking the wood out. So that's one consideration, fine. But we also have the economics, so that's called the economics of the marketplace. But we also have economics of nature, we also have economics of survival. What's economic survival? People rely, ordinary people, smallholders rely on those resources for their livelihood.
Basically,
so you also must put that into the equation.
But actually, like in the case of the EU, they are using this. They pretend that they care about the deforestation, and then they sort of criticize Malaysia in this palm oil dispute. As if Malaysia as a country does not care about it.
But you see, but that is where the sovereignty of a country comes in, because we are the masters of our sovereign rights. So we know, that's why we put this in the balance of this economics of the marketplace, economics of survival, because you must allow your people to survive, right? So you have to put that into the basket of considerations. And then you have economics of nature. Because when you cut down forests and then there is climate change and then people's farms are flooded and people are displaced and landslides and all that, that's also economics of nature. So the point that we are making is that it's up to a sovereign country to balance these factors and make a decision, which cannot be interfered with through extra so-called trade-related rules, which undermine the sovereignty of a country to run the country in its own.
So basically you're not against the arguments that they say, like, you have to look at the environment, you have to look at the people, but you are criticizing the way that they're using it to attack the sovereignty of this country.
Because they are using the development imperative as overriding everything else. That's our point, that our decision makers must be allowed to balance the development imperative with the economics of the marketplace, where you get foreign currency, with the economics of survival for ordinary because in most developing countries, the population lives outside of the formal sector. Here also, if you go around afterward, you will see people putting trucks and food and so on and so forth for sale. So that has to be taken into account, and also economics of nature, because if it compromises everything you have now, weather, refugees and so on and so forth. So all these countries should be able to take into account. Yeah. And the right of hegemonic power to undermine that has to be curtailed. Yeah. Through these international processes, which does not happen because they control the levers of power, economic, political. And so.
But yeah, if we look at it from a financial aspect, we also see that China, as a growing world power, also they're cutting away from the dollar as a main currency. That is that not a signal or a sign that actually this U.S. ruled empire is already weakening? Or
I mean, it's quite obvious that it's weakening. I think now with the Gaza war, people have seen the kind of hypocritical nature of the lopsided foreign policy of the U.S. So it's losing its. That is why they have come back on this resolution in favor of the resolution. Not that they wanted their resolution, but they have to try. Even Joe Biden is talking about the fact that they are undermining their own credibility in the world. You see, yeah. And once they lose credibility, then they lose a lot of stuff, including currency, because the currency previously was based on the dollar backing, or on the gold backing. Now it's no longer the gold backing. So America can produce any amount of currency it wants to fulfill its needs. And people buy into it because of the hype that the Federal Treasury puts forward and says, okay, the dollar is the safest
currency.
But
that's already over, it seems, this belief in...
It's getting over. I mean, it's not over yet, because don't forget, China also invests, largest investors of bonds in America is China. So China is caught in a kind of a trap, because if it moves out that currency,
they will lose a lot of
money. But if it keeps there, then it will bolster the US economy.
Connected through that.
Media Mondo.
Media Mondo is een onafhankelijk platform. We ontvangen geen subsidie, we zijn niet verbonden aan wat voor instantie dan ook. Om ons werk te kunnen doen zijn we dus afhankelijk van individuele sponsoring. Mocht je ons werk willen ondersteunen, we kunnen donaties goed gebruiken.